Now, for more on how Amazon's new headquarters could really impact the economies of its host cities, let's bring in Farhad Alavia. Farhad is partner at Acrivis Law Group. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So let's start with the backlash to these tax breaks and incentives. Is it surprisingly, and more importantly, is it justified?
Well, there has always been some backlash. The question is, does it merit this corporate welfare effectively to give all these benefits to companies to relocate and basically take jobs from one jurisdiction and bring them to another one? Does it make economic sense for the states? One thing you'll notice, though, is that that's really, and it's been shown in studies, that it's not necessarily the only determinant in how and what kind of companies certain jurisdictions or states or cities get. If you look at Virginia's example, for example, Virginia offered much less in incentives than competing Maryland right across the border. So it's a mix of many things. So to assign it purely on governments giving money, I think, is a little bit premature.
Now, it's interesting because that does seem to be the focus. People aren't really talking about the other factors that goes into it. And in fact, The Atlantic said that Amazon's efforts should be considered illegal. What's your take on that?
I think there's a lot of, understandable feelings about, for example, states giving out many tax incentives, grants, other types of funding, upgrades to infrastructure that might not be otherwise needed if these companies were not to relocate, only to see in many cases sometimes these companies wind up hiring less people than planned or not really delivering on what would be considered their side of the bargain. But you have to realize that I think the decision ultimately to move to Washington and to New York is not an accident that just happened by a nice package of perks and benefits, but rather the culmination of, these are two major global cities that have so much else to offer. As I've said, other jurisdictions offered a lot more and didn't get it, but there's certain things that are on the ground in Washington and DC, like the talent pool, like access to mass transport, for example, that don't exist elsewhere. So it's not just the money.
Now, obviously, jobs were the big selling point. You kept seeing this 50,000 jobs number. What kind of jobs, though? What kind of quality jobs are being created?
That really sits, I think, at the core of why this was such a hot news item in this country, because it wasn't just a matter of 50,000 or now 25,000 in each jurisdiction jobs, but really Amazon, I think, symbolizes for many the future. And it's a matter of this whole idea of tech and everybody trying to mimic Silicon Valley and becoming a tech hub in this country. And also commensurate with that is the fact that these jobs tend to be very high paying. And it's the wave of the future. It's more, I guess, immune from other sectors of the economy that have become increasingly obsolete over time.
Now, what about the longer-term impact on things like housing? We obviously saw what happened in Silicon Valley as more and more companies moved into these areas. What sort of effect can we expect on housing and perhaps other sectors?
Oh, naturally, this will put a strain on the housing market as well as on the transportation networks, the roads, the bridges, schools, for example, hospitals. These will all be factored in. And I think what's also important, and one of the reasons many states and cities were interested in this, was not just Amazon coming in, but whenever a major company moves to a certain locale like that, with that comes many other companies that might support that industry. So we're not just looking at 25,000 jobs and the families that come with that, but rather many, many more. And that could lead to a need for much more investment in expanding our infrastructures, both in Northern Virginia and in New York.
Now, what about the fallout that can come with this for the residents themselves? We saw that some people were essentially texting to try and buy up some of the properties in Queens, sight unseen. What does this mean in terms of how it changes the local community?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think it's going to change the impact. In Washington, for example, we've traditionally been a city that's been focused around the government, and our private sector, in many respects, is based on the government and government contractors. This is a very different type of company. And with that, I think, brings a certain culture, certain types of individuals, certain types of businesses, restaurants, hotels, that can change the fabric of that community, and more broadly, even the metropolitan Washington area. Now, with that, I think there will be some dramatic changes that might discomfort others and might please others at the same time. I think it's a matter of what your preference is, but naturally, this is a concern of policy planners to make sure that people don't get locked out of their longstanding neighborhoods.
Now, we have seen what happens when certain regions or areas rely on one company, and then all of a sudden, if the company leaves or things change, essentially that region becomes devastated. Just how much of a risk is it for cities to implement and put all this money in and all these incentives for one company?
I think it varies based on the city. One of the unique factors, I think, here is that in both the case of New York, naturally, and in Washington, this is a key issue for both these jurisdictions, which is why they did offer some incentives, and New York in particular. However, Obviously, New York is a global financial hub. DC is a nation's capital. Neither of these cities will be reliant on Amazon or even the industries that they bring with them. These are very diversified economies. And I think that's what maybe singles out these markets versus smaller cities that might have depended much more wholeheartedly on this type of relocation. And you see in those cases, especially in the Midwest, for example, if one company shuts down, it has a drastic effect. That's not to say that Amazon couldn't have an impact, but this is obviously a very mature, diversified market, as is New York.
Certainly important to note. Thank you again for your insights. Farhad Alavia, partner at Acrivis Law Group.